I think that's from the previous
There's
session.
from Janice.
Excellent. All right, so.
Before you get started,
Yes?
I got something for you.
Do you? Is it better than my Theory Line t-shirt?
Maybe not.
We think so.
We're gonna get one of these.
Yay! Thank you. Good.
Who did the art for that?
Quad Lord over at Dragon Mount.
Cool.
Yeah, Philip Heckman, that's his real name.
And-
Same one he did last year.
Yeah, the same guy that did last year's art for us. Yeah, he's kind of our guy now.
Thank you, guys.
Uh-huh.
Oh, good. All right. So, number one, I apologize for the cancellation of my signing tonight. If you want books signed, we can do it after this. I didn't schedule my flight or my signing, but they both got scheduled at the same time. And so I can't really be signing at 4 when my plane leaves at 4:05. Yeah, we looked at moving it to a different day or having me leave later, and it just turned out not being viable, particularly with the 3-month-old baby. We don't really want to be risking being, number one, split apart on a flight, and number two, flying and having 3 layovers and things like that. So, I'm still going to do this though, and I hope you guys are ready to listen, and I hope that I'm ready to say something interesting. No.
So you have a new baby?
Yes, I have a 3-month-old. Thank you.
Great.
And once again, I apologize for talking with my mouth full. These lozenges are kind of large, but they're very useful for keeping my throat from getting too scratchy. So, today we're going to talk about plotting, okay? Is there anything else I wrote down that I was going to talk about? Anyone, what's it say on the thing? So the big, in my mind, when I think about writing, see, the odd thing about doing what I do is, I have a master's degree in English, right? Master's degree actually in creative writing, bachelor's in English. And that side of me has taught me to study writing. A lot of the things I'm talking about, I don't sit down and think about distinctly when I write. Does that make sense? Any more than a musician when they play a concerto, violinist is not thinking about, okay, now I pull the bow and then I move. You're doing these things instinctively. It's the same thing with writing. And yet the other half of my brain, that is the scholar, always likes to, after the fact, pick apart what am I doing? How am I building this? How is this working? And so a lot of things I talk to you guys here today are things that is the scholar's interpretation of what the artist is doing. And the scholar may be fallible. I'm not even really sure. But this is how I interpret it. One of the big interpretations I do is when I look at outlines that I've built instinctively and divide them up, and I now started doing this a little more consciously, is really we've got 3 spheres of existence that create a book. We've got our plot, we've got our character, and we've got our setting. When I think about planning a book, when I start building an outline, I usually go into Microsoft Word and do you guys know about the document map function in Microsoft Word? It's a way to build an outline. It helps me because I look at things visually. You may want to study it. It's a very easy, intuitive feature to use, and it's an easy outlining feature. Makes it very nice to skip around in a document and things like this. So, document map. I will usually write plot, setting, character, and make those heading number 1 in the document map so that I have these big 3 headings. This is actually step 2, building this outline. Step 1 is all the stuff that happens in my head before I officially, formally start writing a book. And this is the way I do it. As I said yesterday, the way I do it is not the way you have to do it. But sometimes describing what I am doing helps new writers to understand, to give them things that they can try out or to teach them to analyze their own process. So, plot, setting, and character. Beforehand, I'm looking for ideas. The most common question that authors get, they get so often it has become a cliche, is where do you get your ideas? Generally, that is asked by people who are newer authors or who haven't written themselves, who find the idea process the most fascinating part. As I talked about yesterday, ideas are generally cheap. A person who trains themselves to write will have a dozen good ideas a day, and maybe one great idea a week, depending on what your own process is. The trick is to train yourself to write those ideas down when you have them so you don't lose them, to combine those ideas into better ideas, and to then build a story out of them. Ideas combining for me is much like, works in much the same way that a molecule is built. An idea is a cool little atom bouncing around in my brain. And one little atom does not make a story for me. And this is something I notice in a lot of newer writers. They have one pretty good idea, and then they try to build and hang everything on this idea. And it turns into a one-trick pony. Your story doesn't, a lot of times they'll start writing and only get a few pages in and then be like, well, what now? They have some great plot idea, but they don't have interesting, compelling characters to keep the story going long enough for that plot to mean anything in that case. That's just one example. So these ideas are popping around in my head, and when they start to combine in interesting ways and stick together, that is when I know that I have a book that is being built. And those books, I generally write all these ideas down in my phone or in a notebook. I have a file on my computer which is named, and I kid you not, cool stuff that needs to be used sometime. I just named it that once when I had like a random idea and wrote it down, and then that started building, and now it's my repository of ideas, and the file's just the same name. And so the cool stuff needs to be used sometime. Writing all this down, thinking about these ideas, having them interact, and a story will start to bud in my mind at that point, with ideas interacting. If you've read Mistborn, Mistborn, I can explain this because it happened very obviously in the plot this section. It's not always starting at plot with me. Sometimes it's starting with characters, sometimes it's starting with setting. Usually it's a little bit of each combining in an interesting way that I then fill out. So for Mistborn, I had the, I was watching Lord of the Rings movie, and I had recently read one of the Harry Potter books, and I was thinking about the monomyth. Do you guys know what the monomyth is? This is Joseph Campbell, Here with a Thousand Faces, the heroic archetype. If you want to know more about it, you can read that book or look it up. I don't actually suggest it to new authors very often because the monomyth, the heroic archetype, is not a guide to writing a story. It's a description after the fact of what some people do when they write a story. And if you start to take the description and look at it as law, then you end up writing bad stories. This is a tangent, I do these, but a great example of this is if you watch the prequel movies to Star Wars. There were a whole lot of things wrong with those movies from a fan perspective and from a writing perspective. But if you look at the first movie and you know that Lucas is a devotee of Campbell and has studied Campbell's work perhaps too much, you start seeing him shoehorn into his story elements of the heroic archetype because he feels they have to be there. For instance, the virgin birth is part of the heroic archetype. What Campbell said is, in a surprising number of stories, a virgin birth is involved in the concept of this heroic archetype. How does Lucas interpret that? I must have a virgin birth in order to fulfill this archetype. Shoehorns it in, everyone in the audience says, what? That doesn't fit with your established mythology. It makes little or no sense. What? And he did this several times through those movies where he's like, oh, I need to fulfill the heroic archetype. Here. So don't do that is my suggestion. If you read Campbell, if you read about the heroic story and things, look at it as what it is, which is a description of what people do, and there are elements there you can use and say, if it sparks a great idea, then you can start combining it with other things, but no story needs to have everything or should have everything. So I was watching these things and thinking about the heroic archetype, and I was thinking about epic fantasy as a whole through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and the concept of the Dark Lord, which is a fantasy archetype, the great evil. And I thought that authors had covered approaching that very well in the past, and so my general storytelling instinct, and this is where a lot of my books start in embryo, is, well, how can I do the opposite, or how can I do it in a way that never has been approached before? And in that case, I thought, well, what if the Dark Lord won? when Frodo got to the end, and Sauron said, that was my plan all along. You brought the ring right to me. Thank you. Took the ring, killed him, took over the world. Or what if Voldemort had said, Harry Potter, you're like what, 17? Zap! You're dead. And, the most powerful wizard that's ever lived. There's no reason I shouldn't be able to beat you other than, the author wants me to. So zap! I'll zap her first. Anyway, that was an idea. What if the Dark Lord won? There were problems with this. This is the problem with having only one idea. The problem with this, and I don't know if explaining this will be any use to you, but this is, as I looked at that idea, I kept saying, oh, that's a great idea, I should write that story. And then a larger piece of my mind kept saying, no, don't write that story. This is not ready, don't write that story. And I said, why not write that story? Well, the reason is I came to realize, and I've talked to new readers who will often say, I've got a really great twist on the epic story, and let me tell you about it, and their twist happens at the end. But in order to get to that ending, they have to have a generic fantasy story. That runs you into problems because if your grand story is, I'm going to change the genre and revolutionize it by having my ending be totally unexpected, you are going to have a reader, therefore, read all the way through the end, and one of two things is going to happen. Either they're looking for a more generic fantasy story, and they enjoy it up until the ending, where you have this ending that is a disaster to them, or they don't like generic fantasy stories, so they read the first few chapters and put your book down, and don't get to your cool twist ending. And I've seen a lot of fantasy writers, new writers, and even published writers, I've seen books fail because of this, because the last 5 chapters are this revolutionary new thing for the genre, but to get there you have to spend 25 chapters reading the cliched story. That's a bad idea. And my instincts were saying don't do that until I analyzed it and said, oh, that's why that's a bad idea. And I will come back to that a little bit later, why I was going in depth about that one. But so I just let that idea sit in embryo. And it wouldn't work until it combined with other ideas. Until I was watching, you guys seen the movie Sneakers?
Oh, yeah.
And both of these plot ideas came from movies. I was watching that and thinking, man, I love heist movies. They just, I love the gang of thieves who each have a special talent who get together. And I wish we had more good ones. And wait, I'm an author. I could write one of these, and it could be a fantasy novel. Fantasy novel where everybody has a different magical power. And so there was that, and that bounced around in my head. And I said, oh, I should write that book. I should write that book. And then part of me said, no, you shouldn't write that book because you write epic fantasy. You love epic fantasy. That's not an epic fantasy plot. Maybe someday you'll write that story, but it's really not appropriate now. Those two ideas were not ideas I could write on their own. They would just not have worked. When they hit each other and ran into each other, and I said, woo, Dark Lord won 1,000 years ago. Now we've got an epic fantasy story with a gang of thieves pulling off a pseudo heist that launches us into an epic plot. That started to grow into a full novel. All right? And then I said, well, and I've got this thing I've been wanting to do, a kind of pseudo-Dickensian atmosphere, evil Dickensian. And that was a setting idea I've been wanting to do for a while, dark Dickensian, in an epic fantasy. That stuck on, and it started to grow, and I'm like, ooh, we can build that. And things started sticking on, setting, plot, character, and it started to grow. And then that is when I said, I've got this, I've got it, I've got to go for it. And so I built my outline like this. I went plot, setting, character, in the file, and set them as headings, and then I started bullet pointing underneath them all the cool ideas I had for this book, and I looked at them on the page and separated them out into plot, setting, and character ideas. These should all be intermixed. It's not like your plot is independent of your characters, but